Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And indeed, we are in quite an extraordinary period of economic history for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is, for the first time in centuries, millennials are now said to be probably the first generation since before the Industrial Revolution that will be poorer than their parents. And it's looking like this is not just going to be an anomaly as well. If anything, the generation that's younger than us, Generation Z, is looking to be even poorer than millennials. So this is now a sustained trend. And in the UK, some people say this is the first time this has happened since the early 19th century. But actually that was somewhat of an anomalous period. There was the Napoleonic Wars and various other events happening at the time. I think you can actually go back quite a few hundred years to see a pattern like this. I really think it is very, very unusual. But also you shouldn't really underestimate how profound the development this is. The question is this to do with some recent economic policies, for instance, or is there something deeper that's happening? And that is the title of my talk today, Is the West in Civilisational Decline? And there have been some interesting books written in recent years on this trend. One of them was called The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert Gordon, a professor of economic history in the US. And he argued that actually from roughly the early 20th century, the amount of innovation has actually been in decrease. And then this stagnation of living standards then set in. Then there was another book called The Great Stagnation by Tyler Cowen, which actually argues something similar, that from roughly the early 20th century, there has been a steady decline in the amount of innovation in technology and science, and then from roughly the 1970s onwards, this stagnation really set in. Another thinker on this is called Jonathan Hubner. And he was a physicist, actually, working for the US government, plotting technological and scientific developments over hundreds of years. And he argued also that they increased steadily from roughly the medieval period over the centuries, and then went into decline from roughly World War I onwards. Now, you may be thinking, well, come on, what about smartphones? What about flat screen televisions and all of these other developments? Well, if we compare the two periods then, for instance, 1850 to 1920 and 1950 to 2020, between 1850 and 1920, we saw the invention of the automobile, the telegraph, the telephone, the computer, the aeroplane, motion pictures. We saw the electrification of cities, the radio, typewriter, reinforced concrete, X-rays, recorded music, germ theory, and indeed many other developments. Prior to all of this, if someone wanted to get a message from Europe to the USA, someone actually had to sail across the Atlantic and deliver that message. People were still riding around on horseback. So the lives that people were living in 1920 compared to 1850 were really radically different. From 1950 to 2020 then, most of the developments that happened were iterative improvements, at least it's argued, on these previous developments from the late 19th and early 20th century. So anything from televisions to washing machines, and actually, of course, even though computers and smartphones are a significant development, they're still, in a sense, improvements on technologies that were developed in this previous period. Now, we just had a talk on AI, and indeed, I think that does have the potential to be a truly revolutionary technology, and indeed is revolutionary. We are just finishing a book on AI, which I did with Lord Fairfax. It's called The Artificial Intelligence Revolution, an academic book to be published by Springer Nature. And we have many of the top experts from around the world writing chapters in this book. including some of the AI experts that were just mentioned. So this book will be out in the next few weeks in hardback. So AI is something I've been fascinated by for many years, since I was a teenager. But nevertheless, thus far, it's certainly not bringing about the productivity improvements that some people have claimed would happen. In fact, we still have stagnant or even falling living standards for young people. So what happened then during this period I mentioned, from the 19th century into the early 20th century, where there really were these extraordinary developments in living standards by just about every possible metric? Well, prior to this, there have, of course, been a number of great civilizations. In China, the Song and Tang dynasties gave the world paper, movable type printing, gunpowder, and the compass, among many other innovations. Ancient India saw developments in pure mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. And the Islamic Golden Age gave us the very words algebra and algorithm, among many others. In ancient Greece, in 200 BC, the ancient Greek polymath Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth to within about 1% accuracy by putting sticks in the ground and measuring the shadows at different times of day. Yet actually, across all of these millennia, living standards actually remained remarkably flat. There was not a smooth increase in living standards over the last few thousand years, as is sometimes imagined. Living standards actually, GDP per capita was roughly around $1,000 per year or a few $100s per year in all of these civilizations. And life expectancy was also roughly about 30 once you take into account infant mortality. Because again, up until this remarkable period of history, roughly half of, or almost half of all of the human beings that were born died in infancy. And then what happened then was this remarkable period of history in the West, what I will call today the Promethean epoch of history. And from the Enlightenment onwards, Europe and the US saw the first sustained increase in living standards in history. It saw the innovations that happened from the Enlightenment onwards in the 18th, the 19th, and the early 20th century, as I mentioned, revolutionized everything: the railway, telephone, electrification. Sir Charles Babbage invented the computer, and then shortly after, Ada Lovelace was the first computer programmer. But then additionally, we saw the first modern financial markets and copyright law, and the rise in prominence of the modern corporation. James Clerk Maxwell discovered the laws of electromagnetism, and Charles Darwin changed how we understand our place in the world, while Einstein and quantum theory changed how we understand our place in the universe. But this period was also an apex point in world history when it comes to political developments. It saw the banning of slavery. It saw the birth of modern economics with the writings of Adam Smith, Frederick Bastiat, and others. And even the very terms left-wing and right-wing come from the National Assembly around the time of the French Revolution, where the different factions sat. So this Promethean epoch then was more than just science and technology. In fact, it brings to mind a quote from Aeschylus's masterpiece, Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus is indeed bound to the rocks, and he says to the sea nymphs, "I gave them hope, and so turned away their eyes from death, and I gave them fire, that thereby they might learn many arts." And of course, in Prometheus's tragedy, Prometheus does not just steal fire from the gods, he also teaches humans the arts and sciences. And during this Promethean epoch then, just as important as these developments in economics and science was the evolution of culture. The invention of the novel in its modern form allowed a journey into the human soul that was unparalleled. But there was also extraordinary developments with music, with harmonic complexity, through Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Berlioz, and Mahler, among many others. Now, at the core of this epoch was the Enlightenment, but to say that it was only Enlightenment values would really be too narrow. It began really during the early Renaissance and, for instance, Romanticism in the 19th century. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin said that 19th century Romanticism was the greatest single shift in the consciousness of the West. And this also served to enrich European culture, bring about a new flourishing of literature and music. So in other words, rather than trying to define this Promethean epoch in terms of specific institutions, it makes more sense to think of Europe as having a certain élan vital. It's actually difficult to describe, really, but the same élan vital that gave us science and industry also gave us Goethe's Faust and Franz Liszt's Sonata in B minor. So then, I noted earlier the historians of science and economic historians who write about how this trend of innovation went into decline from the early 20th century, actually from around the time of World War I. And in particular, it was the curve of Jonathan Hubner that set off a lot of this research, where he argued that really World War I was the beginning of this descent. And I think you could argue, again, this goes well beyond just science and technology. It's difficult to think of works of literature, let's say from the 1970s onwards, that match those of Tolstoy or Proust or James Joyce or Dostoevsky. And during this period, the harmonic complexity of music likely also peaked with Gustav Mahler and his late symphonies pushing the chromatic scale to its limits. So then, with this in mind, if we start to examine some thinkers who have looked at the rise and fall of civilizations throughout history, let's see what we can learn from them to see what's happening here. Now, the first we'll look at is Joseph Tainter, a relatively recent thinker, who wrote about how civilizations reach a point where they become more and more complex until they essentially become sclerotic from so much bureaucracy. Now, I'm sure many of us are familiar with this, living in Europe and really the rest of the developed world as well. But I think it's also more complex than just that. Another thinker, John Bagot Glubb, who was a British army officer and wrote a lot on history as well. He argued that civilizations go through 6 phases. The phase of pioneers, of conquests, of commerce, of affluence, of intellect, and then of decadence. And you can certainly see patterns of that with Europe during this period. But then also the Islamic thinker Ibn Khaldun argued that civilizations rise through what he called asabiyyah. That's really a social cohesion and a united purpose. And when this social cohesion begins to dissipate, then that is when a civilization begins to go into decline, when there is no more shared values, for instance. Some of you may have seen the BBC series Civilization by Kenneth Clark. That's available on YouTube actually now. And he famously argued that, among other things, it's when a civilization loses confidence in itself, that's when a civilization goes into decline. We may also see patterns of that today as well. But then also a particularly important thinker was Arnold Toynbee. And actually around the time of World War I, when it shows many of these patterns going into decline, Toynbee argued our own postmodern age has been inaugurated by the General War of 1914 to 1918. So he recognized that some type of profound shift had happened around the time of World War I. And Toynbee analyzed 26 different civilizations throughout history. And he famously argued that civilizations don't die as a result of murder, but rather as a result of suicide. Civilizations go into decline because of factors within their civilization rather than outside forces. And in particular, he argued that the, quote, creative minority becomes a, quote, dominant minority. So during the rise of a civilization, the class of leaders would be, let's say, like the Medici, funding beautiful art and beautiful architecture. They don't even really think twice about it. It's just natural that they would want to produce this beautiful architecture that will be here for hundreds of years. And then eventually, when a civilization goes into decline, that creative minority is replaced by a self-serving dominant minority. They no longer produce beautiful architecture or art. They're not interested in these things. They just want to protect their own power. We can certainly, that certainly seems familiar today. And so what results is cultural stagnation and loss of energy. But actually, Toynbee argued that this was not inevitable. Another thinker, the last thinker we'll look at, is Oswald Spengler, who was writing roughly 100 years ago. And he argued that the rise and fall of civilizations is cyclical. You have a spring, a summer, an autumn, and a winter. And if we think about the West, for instance, the spring might be roughly from the time of Magna Carta. Well, Spengler actually argued that the West had gone through two cycles. Greco-Roman civilization was what he called Apollonian civilization after the god Apollo. And that followed this rise and fall pattern. And now we have essentially the second cycle of Western civilization, what he called Faustian civilization. So you could argue that, for instance, the spring of Faustian civilization was around the type of Magna Carta, and then you go through the Renaissance, the summer of civilization, and the Enlightenment. And then autumn is when a civilization goes into cultural decline and begins to lose its energy. And then he actually argued that at some point in the early 21st century, Faustian civilization would go into its civilizational winter. So the question is then, if we examine our current situation, what can we learn from each of these thinkers? I think they all have ideas that we can learn from. Tainter, of course, talked about the amount of bureaucracy, the sclerotic bureaucracy of civilizations in their late stages. That's certainly something we can all learn from, but that's something relatively easy to fix. I think there are deeper problems with the West. Ibn Khaldun talked about asabiya, this idea of social cohesion and shared values. I think that has also gone into decline. That is something more difficult to rebuild than just getting rid of bureaucracy, for instance. Glubb, of course, talked about these different phases of civilizations. But I think, for instance, the idea of becoming an interplanetary species, this great ambition of Elon Musk and others, actually does start to revive some of that spirit of the Promethean epoch. Then, of course, there was Kenneth Clark, who talked about the decline in self-confidence of a civilization being the key factor. Again, I think in many respects that comes from many of those other things that we're talking about, being surrounded by beautiful architecture and so on. Toynbee, of course, discussed the ruling class of a civilization and how they must be this creative minority if a civilization is going to produce great works of art, great scientific endeavors and architecture and so on. And then finally, Spengler, I think he's evidently pessimistic when it comes to this fatalism of the rise and fall of civilizations and their life cycle. But I think one of the key things we can learn from Spengler actually is this idea that civilizations, their rise and fall manifests itself in so many aspects, in architecture, in art, in music. It's not just a case of, if we get rid of some bureaucracy and implement some pro-business policies, everything will be fine after that, much as I would like to do those things. But nevertheless, there are some important differences with where we find ourselves now relative to these dozens of other civilizations that were studied. The first one is the nature of the Promethean epoch that has occurred over the last quarter of a millennium or so. As I mentioned, living standards actually remained pretty flat through almost all of human history, whether it's China, Rome, or wherever else. What we've seen over the last quarter of a millennium especially is something truly extraordinary and unprecedented in human history. Secondly, I think this fatalism that sometimes appears with these historians of the rise and fall of civilizations. If we look at China, for instance, when Deng Xiaoping became premier in 1979, I think it was, China's GDP per capita was something like $200 or $300 a year. It was poorer than most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the GDP per capita in China in the late 70s was lower than it had been 1,000 years earlier at the time of the Sung dynasty, when they were producing all of these great inventions. And within 2-3 generations, China has completely transformed itself. So I don't like this fatalism of some of these thinkers that I've been discussing. But also I think it's really become quite a deep psychological factor, in Europe especially, but frankly to a certain extent in the US, of just this loss of ambition, this loss of this spirit that did produce the Promethean epoch. And so whilst we can hopefully bring in more pro-business policies, that's really the surface level and the easiest things that we would need to do to truly revive the West. Thank you very much.